Thank you, Tilia. So I'm Dr. Orlanda Harvey. I teach on some of the CPD leadership programs, and I am delighted today to be co-presenting with Sarah.
Hello, my name's Sarah Green, and I have been working within Bournemouth University for at least 15 years, but I've worked in both faculty, in an academic environment, and also I'm currently working within the Estates Department in the support side of things. So I'm coming at this very much as a practitioner. I'm very much out of my comfort zone today. So thank you all for your patience whilst we do this. So thank you.
Okay, so what we would like to talk about today is leading change, and we're going to focus on bringing our people with us, because we think that's a really important part of the whole change process, and the how we do that is integral to leading effective change. But the first thing we would like to do is to ask you to share with us your thoughts about what's important as leaders. So I have a little answer garden. I've put it in the chat for you with a link, but we have a QR code there as well. What we'd love you to do is follow the link in the chat, or if you've got your phone with you, you can follow the QR code, just scan that and share your thoughts on what do leaders need to consider when implementing change, if that's okay. And in a second, I will share the answer garden that is going to be hopefully growing. So hopefully everybody's had a chance now to scan the QR code. I say, if not, you can pick the link up from the chat. And hopefully everybody can now see my screen, and we can see some of the amazing answers that are coming up in our answer garden. So what I'm noticing here, and what I really, really like, is that right at the center of this is around understanding why the change is happening. And then we've got some really interesting people things here for me around clear communications, that we all want to do a good job, that actually, you know, people come with a very positive intent into the workplace about doing with people. And I think that's been a message that's come through from some of the other presentations today as well. We have things in here as well around neurodiversity, which is really important when it comes to change and understanding difference. The timing of the change fatigue. Yes, that's a thing I think we're all feeling at the moment. A lot of us around change seems to be continuous, and there's not enough time to land and ground the change. And we see that in a lot of our leadership models, actually, that they talk about this time for embedding change in. And it doesn't seem like the workplaces we work in at the moment have time to do that. So timescales, impact on stakeholders. Yes, Colin was talking earlier on this morning about stakeholders, thinking about ensuring the change is needed, really, really important, and what we're wanting to do. Sarah, any thoughts that you want to add from what we can see there?
I love the fact that communication is a really big theme, because I think hopefully when we go through my case study, you're all on the right path with that. I love the fact that there's the reason why. Give the reason why, and it's there with a capital W. For me, that is absolutely critical to be able to clearly communicate and to be able to take people along with you while you do it. If you're not sure of the why, then you're never going to be able to communicate that to somebody else.
Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing and put us back in our slides. You can add to the answer garden if you have thoughts, or you can follow that link anytime to see where everybody else is in terms of their thoughts about change. But it's very much understanding that change is actually something that's often very necessary and important, but doing it right is very, very difficult. So for me, the heart of change is that people are all different, and key to managing change effectively and leading it is to understand that people are going to react in very different ways. They'll have lots of reasons for reacting in those different ways. So that's what we're going to have a look at today. And it's my role just to give you a few of the models, get you to think about it. And then Sarah's going to come in and give us a lovely case study around one of the models that she particularly likes in terms of thinking about leading change within her team. So the model here that is quite interesting is to get to thinking about change as a transition, that there are three aspects of any transition process, and the starting point is what we leave behind. And sometimes as leaders, we forget to celebrate and acknowledge the successes, what have gone before and where we've got to. Though people in our teams were involved in those achievements, involved in the situation we're in. And quite often people will feel disengaged if they think that we're dismissing what's gone before, which might have been fit for purpose at a certain time, and in itself might have been a really radical change when it came in. So the starting point is to think about what we're leaving behind and think about how we let go of old ways of working, old behaviors, and think about how we support people through that. And then for bridges, we go into this neutral zone that the old is going, but we haven't yet established what the new looks like, and people are in different places. So we have these feelings around discomfort and loss, uncertainty and opportunity, all in this neutral zone. And I'm a bit Star Trekky here. I love that image. It really makes me think of there's this uncomfortable, chaotic period that we have to go through. And in Tilia's and Rejoice's presentation with Lyle, they were talking about, how people are resilient, what gets us down. And I think change can add to this, particularly if there's change going on in our personal lives at the same time. And then we have this new beginning, these new ways of working being established, these new ways of being in our workplace. And again, this can be a slightly uncomfortable time because it seems now that we don't often get time to embed this. We're working in environments which are, low on resources, where people keep thinking that a new idea will make us more efficient. And so we don't have time to really embed these changes. But actually, that's quite important for people to feel the value of having gone through this discomfort, that what's come out the other side is worthwhile. So there's a very, very standard model of grief that Kubler-Ross had around 1969 in these 5 stages. And the model that we're going to show you now in terms of change aligns to this model of grief. In fact, it comes from that because there is a theory around the fact that when we're changing something, we are having a loss, even though we might be excited about it. And people have different experiences about how they buy into that change and why they're doing it. So the transition is an emotional engagement, and it's about, as leaders, allowing understanding and time to do that transition. And as a leader, you're going to be likely to be ahead of everybody else. You're going to see the destination. You're going to perhaps be more bought into it for a number of different reasons. And some of the people in your teams might not even know that they're on that journey, let alone where you are. You're ahead of the curve quite often. And it's remembering that position that you're in and where that means for you. So the model that helps us to explore that is the personal transition curve, and it's a model by Fisher. And it helps us to understand that we can each be at different stages, that change will affect each of us in different ways, and that we have our own pace going through this model. So this is really taking a very compassionate leadership approach. It's about understanding where individuals might be, but you could also, if you're a strategic leader looking at different changes for different teams, even use this to say where different teams are in the stages of change. So you think about where you are as a leader, you might think about where your teams are, you might work with individual members to see where they feel, and it can be a really interesting way of engaging people with the transition, with the process of change. So Sarah, I'm now going to hand over to you to show us how this works.
Thank you. So this is a relatively small scale case study. It's recent. I won't, full disclosure, we are still working our way out of the curve. We have not made our way out of the end of the curve. So it's very much a live case study for me. So we are looking at how we use this transition curve approach to help us implement change and to help us feel confident that we're taking the right actions and that we are engaging positively with our staff to help them through this process. So I'm looking at a small group of 4 established staff, some of which are very long-standing, more than 15 years in the post, and even the most recent team member has been in post for 4 years. Previously, they were all managed by different individuals with differing levels of experience and understanding of that role that was being undertaken. These 4 members of staff support the annual cycle of timetabling and scheduling within the faculty. So there's some very high pressure situations 2 or 3 times a year. And historically, that role has been poorly resourced and supported for a number of years. We've also got the situation that those individuals are highly personally invested in those outcomes, and there is a strong sense of pride. But alongside that, there's a lack of resilience and the sustainability of those processes. So illness cover and support was an issue. And finally, we need to take into account that there was a long period of review, it's been going on for nearly 3 years, before this eventual proposal was enacted earlier this year. So the proposed change, very briefly, was to change the line management structure. So instead of being managed by separate individuals, one single line manager within my team, although not me, that knows and understands very well the complex processes and challenges that these staff are involved with and that role is part of. And we were able also to fortunately secure some additional staff resource and 1 additional fixed term post to bring in to allow support for this transition period and provide headspace to allow us to improve some of the processes, share best practice, and learn to cover and support each other as a team. So the main leadership task was to bring these 4 disparate individuals together with shared goals to be a team that works together and supports each other, and add in a new team member to this established group. And the aim overall was to improve the support for these staff and improve the sustainability, consistency, and effectiveness of these processes and outcomes. So if we take this onto the curve and start with the change instigated, I'll just take you through some of the basic leadership actions that we undertook using this cycle to plan it, and also how some of the realised emotions showed themselves and some of the impacts of that. So to start off with, the change was instigated by a review that those staff were part of. So they were already invested in this change. We looked at it and we were able to acknowledge and value the past efforts and achievements by the team, and I was able to put the team forward for an award, and they won an award within the university to recognise the support that they provided during the pandemic, which is a really helpful positive springboard. We were also able to recognise and value best practice and also welcome and value the difference of approaches that we could find within this team. I was very careful to explain the why as we moved towards the consultation for this process, and we were able to directly link it to feedback and comments that these group members had provided during the original review. So being able to use this evidence to remind staff and to remind them that we were listening to where they come from was hugely valuable. We also had to be honest and set the expectations for the processes and outcomes clearly and early on. And I had to be really prepared to evidence that, why I thought this solution would work, how were we going to test whether it had worked, and step forward in those processes. And overwhelmingly, the emotions that we had from the team were, wow, something is finally happening. And then followed very shortly, but the what if? So we moved quite quickly into the kind of the lower part of the transition. So we moved into shock, denial, a sense of loss and grief, and some elements of anger. So because I'd looked at this cycle, I was aware that this was likely to happen. And we took care to hold a lot of meetings with the team and both individually, where we could allow space for their emotions to be felt and heard. Now, I find this quite uncomfortable, but because I had anticipated it with this cycle, I was able to be prepared and open-minded for this. So it was uncomfortable but necessary. We also repeatedly acknowledged that change is hard, but it's often necessary in our work environment. We also allowed acknowledgement of concerns, and we took care to repeat back what had been heard in meetings so that we could be very clear and maximise that shared understanding of viewpoints and understanding. And that I found really helpful because it allowed us to focus on the understanding of the emotions rather than living the emotions. We had to be very calm and consistent in communicating those next steps, aims and objectives, and be prepared to repeat that often through the meetings as we needed to. So there was a lot of emotion at this point. What if I can't do the change? I don't like the current situation, but I don't want anything to change either. So there was potential that we could have got quite stuck. But in understanding those emotions, we were able to move into the hang-in point, which is when you're starting to focus on the future potential of change and starting to help the team envisage how things might be different and that something actually will change. And the big step at this point was to continue to encourage and allow feedback. But at this point, we moved forward to trying to take an appreciative inquiry approach, so allow us to move forward to a positive focus. And Mel will be speaking later about the appreciative inquiry, but it allowed us to not get stuck in a cycle of negative feedback and skepticism, or nothing's going to change. So we were able to move forward at that point. At this point, you do have to remember that you're human and there's a limit to how patient you could be. So I'll touch on some of the resilience and personal touches that you have to bear in mind to move forward. And again, the emotion that we got through at this point is, will this ever feel more comfortable? Okay, that was overwhelmingly what they were feeling. Is this going to get any better? And now we're moving into, and this is where we are in real time, the early engagement and buy-in in the process. So we're working hard to define the parameters for changes for individual workloads. And I genuinely, we talked about the broader parameters, if you like, the shape of the box for this, but I don't have predetermined specifics in mind for what those specific changes are. Now, I can understand that you might not be lucky enough to be in that position. If you do have to have predetermined that, you need to be honest and genuine about that straight off if you are. And this will do wonders to limit the frustration with the team and hopefully maximise empowerment. So just moving quickly on, because I am conscious of time. So we also have and maintain clear performance goals for the teams. So this is taking clear deadlines, process support and consequences for both the team and people that contribute to the processes. So having that understanding of what the consequences would be is tremendously positive in helping those team members envisage that change. Okay. So
Sarah,
that's where we are.
Going to interrupt before we go on to the next slide, because we've got a question and it's around, in your example, your thoughts. Sarah, how did you create a sense of urgency at the beginning or get people engaged? Because you talked a little bit about stakeholder output. So, and we have a question around, did you start to think about a sense of urgency at the beginning to get people into the momentum of this is going to happen?
Yeah, but we are lucky in some ways in that this is an annual cycle with predetermined deadlines. So we actually had a driver. This needs to be understood and in place for February. So that actually creates its own sense of urgency. But fortunately, we're lucky to have senior management support for this process. So we've been able to influence some of the other contributors to the process to understand that this needs to be clearly understood. So we were lucky with that, in that we used the process itself to create the urgency, if you like.
Cool, thank you.
Okay.
Right.
So yeah, if we can move on to lessons from a leader, I'll touch on a few of these quite briefly. I found considering sphere of influence, in addition to the model that we've just talked about, really helpful, because you can't do this on your own. It's dangerous to try, and it will wear you out as an individual. What I found terrifically helpful was to bring in another member of your staff or team to extend your sphere of influence. And it really provided a different style of communication. which was a really refreshing alternative for some of the team members, so that they could listen to things in a different way. And this also helped me to observe, and jumping forward to point 3 on the list there, to observe emotions necessarily rather than feeling with it. So rather than experiencing some of the emotions that the team were expressing, it helped me tremendously to think, that's fascinating. How interesting. I was curious rather than emotionally invested in the same way, which allowed me to look at it more objectively and really listen actively and understand what they were trying to say to me, rather than reacting or responding or feeling defensive. Because I found you've got to be very personally invested in a change like this to be able to provide the patients the energy, and the drive, and to create the urgency and push it through. So that really moves on then to both personal resilience and reflection. I urge you to have a think about, what do you need? Is that a safe space with someone like Orlanda where I can have a quick vent, and understand and explore the situation? Do I need somewhere quietly where I can sit and reflect myself and understand what might be working well or not working so well? And the final point is, do not underestimate how helpful practicing a conversation with somebody might be. A bit of role play absolutely worked wonders on some conversations that I was frankly quite terrified of. And it really took a lot of the tension out of the situation and allowed me to deliver that better to the team members involved, which was actually the aim of the outcome, to make the process less painful for them and less painful for me. So I think that's about it from me. I've probably gone on far too long, so thank you, Orlando.
No, that was really interesting. Thank you, Sarah. So for me, before we have a few questions, if anybody's got anything, it's literally just some ideas for engagement in terms of thinking about your own teams and how you might get them to buy in. And there's some interesting tools here that you can have a look at and think about. So obviously, sphere of influence, Sarah talked about using herself. So this is a model which looks like a target, if you like, and at the center is, well, what do I have direct control over? Around it is, what can I influence? And then around that is, what's out of my control? And the idea is, through conversations and thinking and reflection, we can see if we can move anything from influence into control, from out of control into influence, and then in a way kind of let go of those things that are out of our control, or understand that that's how it is, and that we can't do much about. So that can be a really useful model to work with a coach or a mentor if you have one as a leader for yourself, but it can also be one to bring to the team and use as a team model and say, as a team, we need to influence the organization to this change. What do we control as a team? Who do we influence? So you can adapt some of these models for individual or group situations. Team events. I don't know about you, but I have led as a practitioner in leadership and management years ago, team events that have been terrible. Unfortunately, I've led very good ones. What I've noticed about the ones that work, that there's a purpose to them and everybody knows that. So whether that's a team away day where the purpose is about bringing the team together and just having fun and building relationships, or whether it's a purposeful meeting, and with an aim and looking at something the team is working on, it's understanding and getting buy-in from the team first about what it's about. One of the things I really like to do if I'm looking at team development or working on a team event is to ask the team just to answer 2 sentences. This will be the greatest team meeting for me if ... This will be a complete waste of my time if ... And just getting that information from the team beforehand really helps a leader to shape what that meeting could be about. One-to-one meetings, we seem to be in a very fast-paced world now, where if we don't tend to have these as often as perhaps we should, but touching base with people can be really important to help people understand your vision and get their thoughts on things. But tools that I think we can use, you're about to hear Matt and talk about appreciative inquiry and how he's used that approach with a colleague. I think that can be really useful in a team meeting. We've got things like problem and solution trees that can help. So you get somebody to identify all the problems, and then you have another tree where you identify all the solutions. So you're always looking future focused. I've got De Bono's 6 hats up there. That's a way of how we get parallel thinking instead of thinking where somebody puts an idea up and somebody instantly naysays it. With De Bono's 6 hats, you have a model where you start an idea and everybody has to build on that idea, and then you all as a team look at the negatives. So it brings us together. Stop and continue model is something that most of you will be very familiar with. Again, that's a really useful thing for team engagement. And also there are these team development tools that are out there to help understand and appreciate different ways of working in teams, such as our transactional drivers or our strength deployment industry. Myers-Briggs might be another one. And there are lots of caveats for using those as well, is that this shouldn't be something that we sheep dip on people and then say, now go and understand it. It should be, if we're going to use a tool like that, how does that help us work within the team? How can we create a psychologically safe space to do that in? And how do we work with that going forward? Let's not do things to people, as I think somebody put on the answer garden, let's do things with people. So that's my thoughts for you around ideas for engagement. And Sarah and I hope you found it interesting and welcome any questions or thoughts.
There's nothing in the chat at the moment.
That's okay.
So, Orlanda, can I ask a question?
Of course you can, Paul.
Apologies, just jump in. I know I should have put my virtual hand up. Apologies. Thank you. I've found that really helpful, really interesting. Can I just ask, and thank you for asking my question, and I suppose just to add to that, when it's about sense of urgency, it was more that I recognise that in the literature and in other kind of best practice, there's challenge around starting with a sense of urgency. Is it helpful to start a sense of urgency? And I'm just interested in your thoughts around, from your view, and given the example that you shared, Sarah, did that crop up, and do you think it's helpful to start with a sense of urgency? Because essentially it's the kind of the burning platform, isn't it? And I find myself as a practitioner kind of wrestling with, is it helpful?
I think there is a balance between urgency and the time that you have to implement that change. I think if you start with too much of a sense of urgency, then you can get to the point where people think you're going to rush the change, and they won't have that time to transition. And as Orlanda mentioned, that time to progress through the process is going to be different for lots of different people. Some people are going to springboard all the way from excitement straight to focusing on the future, and other people are going to take longer through it. So I found what was more useful for us was to keep clear about why we need to do this change. And it was helpful that we had some positive extra resource to put in with that. But I was very conscious, because this had been brewing for a very long time, that to make it feel too urgent actually felt almost dismissive in this case. But if it was a more reactive short-term change, I can see that you would be able to drive it forward with more of a sense of urgency. But it was more to be understanding where those individuals were coming from. And because this has been a much longer process for them, I didn't want them to feel dismissed by then trying to drive it through very quickly.
Thank you. Really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you, Orlanda and Sarah, then for your presentation. I certainly, again, have learned a lot, and I will probably take away the thought of how can I plan for change